Our wonderful guest this evening is going to be Mr. Josh Tickell, and he is the co-director, along with his wife Rebecca, of two films on this subject. The first that came out a couple years ago is called Kiss the Ground. The second one is called Common Ground. And Josh, we are thrilled to have you, buddy. Thanks so much for being here this evening.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me. It's great to see everybody. What an amazing committed group of people this is. I mean, you don't see a lot of this level of organization in certainly not in the early days of this movement, but wow, it's encouraging to see.
Well, thank you for that
Yeah,
very much. And so what we had discussed beforehand was we would show the trailer for your upcoming film as kind of a
great.
way to introduce this topic,
Sure.
and then we'll go from there and have an interview and talk about it. So
Great.
I'm going to
Sounds
do
good.
that now. Josh, again, very, very powerful stuff here. I've seen the first film. I haven't seen the second one. I was not able to catch it on the festival circuit. I'm hoping definitely to see it. You're premiering on Earth Day. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Correct. So Common Ground and Kiss the Ground both come out on Amazon Prime globally on Earth Day, which is exciting. So, how many of our languages that is, how many of our countries. And, look, this will be a real test to see how the movement picks this up because we had certainly Kiss the Ground came out during COVID, and that was, you know, incredible to see that in the digital space in Netflix. And now it's off Netflix. Both films will go onto Prime. We'll see how the movement picks it up. Should be pretty exciting.
And for those of you who haven't checked your calendars, April 22nd is Earth Day. And so that's, I believe, a Tuesday, right, this year? And so
You put me on the spot there. Let's see.
oh, well, I can double check it in my calendar if I'm wrong here.
It's a
Um,
Tuesday. You're
it is
correct.
a Tuesday.
Yes.
So that's a Tuesday. So if you don't have Amazon Prime, you probably have a friend who does. If you still don't have a friend that you can think of, I'm your friend. So come over to my place and see the film because I do have access to it. So this is a wonderful, wonderful topic, and it's one that needs to be explored. I know from your first film just that you you do a tremendously effective job as a filmmaker of giving us really, really terrible news and then giving us hope. That's the difficulty, I think, in a lot of films like this. We see people telling us, well, everything's kind of going to hell and we better do something about it. But in this particular area of environmental advocacy and of work, it is something where we pretty much know the answers, and they're not something that is so impossibly difficult for us to do if we just adopt the things that we now talk about, or that we now understand. Could you talk a little bit about that larger journey in terms of your understanding of that and those key things that are available to us?
Well, I think, look, you guys are all committed to climate. You know, this is a big group of people, and there's a tremendous what's inspiring to me always is to go into these communities where you think, oh, no one here cares about the climate. And then there's a regular climate cafe or a regular climate group, and they're working on all the same issues. And so you, whether you know or not, are interconnected across the country in this web of committed organizations. I think, I grew up in the environmental movement. I think I held my first protest sign when I was maybe 6 years old. And so to see over 4 decades the context of that movement constantly grapple with the shifting target of what our ecosystem is enduring. We now have an ecosystem in free fall. If we look at how human beings have contextualized climate and we think, okay, does this ostensibly make sense? We have put 90 something percent of our effort around carbon dioxide specifically. That is not wasted effort, but there's a larger context that we look at in the films. And that is, carbon dioxide is an insulator. So you have to have heat in order for that to be effective, right? Carbon dioxide is not the initiator of the heat cycle. And so what is? The question that we often sort of fail to think about in the climate movement, what is initiating this sort of heat cycle that we're involved in? And largely it's water or a lack thereof. The hydrosphere controls 80% of climatological activity. And so if we're not addressing water as the central sort of climate battery, that's what's going to hold heat or move heat either up or down, we're missing everything that has to do with localized climates. And that means we're missing macroclimates. And so the films, both Kiss the Ground and Common Ground and the forthcoming Groundswell, the third film, they really, if you kind of look under the hood of the film and you're like, well, what is it that we're saying here? Sure, we talk about carbon, we talk about carbon sequestration into soil, but what we're really talking about is the hydration or dehydration of a landscape, which is directly related to how hot not just that landscape is, but the air above that landscape, which is related to rainfall. And that is really, you're looking at the water cycle as a heat pump, either bringing heat down out of the atmosphere or due to the lack of water cycling, allowing heat to reflect off of the surfaces, whether those are largely barren farm fields or city surfaces. NASA did a study a while back where they realized for every 1 million people in an urban environment, you have about a 1 degree Fahrenheit average increase in temperature. It's certainly true with LA. But what's weird is when you look at the Central Valley of California, which is arguably the largest producer of fruits and vegetables in the country, 6% of, pulses and vegetables.
Right.
That is also barren. And that heat effect remains the same. So whenever you dehydrate a landscape by concreting it, cementing it, or removing the plant life, the effect is largely the same. You're moving the water off the landscape. That water is the heat battery. That's what keeps the landscape cool. And so, climatologically speaking, we spend a tremendous amount of time and energy and physical work trying to deal with a gas that is hard for most human beings to sort of wrap their heads around because we can't see it. And we don't spend a lot of time talking about water, which is the thing that we can actually see, right? And I think that's where the films start to really pique our imagination because when you change the context of a problem, you find all sorts of new solutions. And regeneration, whether it's of a small landscape like your backyard or a very large landscape like the Chihuahuan Desert in Common Ground, regeneration changes both the water cycle and the carbon cycle. And when
Right.
we look at how much carbon can be sequestered, we're talking about, arguably 9 billion acres globally that's under agriculture. If you increase just just the soil organic matter, just the top layer by 0.1% a year, you're sequestering 10 tons of carbon, not CO2, hard carbon into every acre, right? And that's a minimal increase. That's you know, and that's not going to stay in the topsoil. That's going to get pulled down by microbial activity into the recalcitrant layers of the soil. So this is a whole world of carbon and water conversations that isn't happening. In fact, when you look at how we contextualize the climate conversation, in the United Nations, there's two meetings. There's a meeting to deal with carbon and solar and wind and money, how much carbon are we going to reduce in our nation? And then there's a totally separate meeting in a totally separate place in a totally separate period of the year, a biodiversity COP.
Believe me, I know this.
And never the two shall
It's
meet,
been, yeah, it's
right?
been a huge source of frustration for me, and I talked to our national chapter about this as well. Yeah, you're absolutely right, and it's so refreshing to hear somebody else say it.
Yeah.
But you're absolutely right. To your point, I think 100 years ago, the formula that was kind of adopted was we know in California, if you dump a ton of water and a ton of fertilizer on anything, it can grow in California.
Mm.
And that kind of became the recipe for the Central Valley. And I talk about this in my own advocacy for native plants. And it's so nice to see the tie-in on that in sustainable practices. Could you, just for a layman who hasn't seen your films yet and who maybe is still trying to wrap their heads around this, talk about maybe the two or three things, kind of a thing that we could do differently that would really change the game in terms of agriculture?
Yeah. And so Charles, I just want to make sure I understand the question. are we talking about personal choices? Are we talking about California? Or are we talking about sort of the agricultural system?
Dealer's choice to some extent, but for our own sake, that would be great. But I'm thinking more in terms of the larger scope of the film because you're looking at the food problem and how we address it internationally. And so I think that's what are people going to see when they come to your film that they're going to get the larger serving of.
Yeah. Well, I think, speaking philosophically first, we have been very much brought into a carbon conversation in which our carbon footprint personally matters, right? That carbon footprint idea was manufactured by British Petroleum as a way to tip the scales into personal responsibility and tip the scales away from corporate and whole systems responsibility.
Right. Like we've done with plastic recycling. Yeah.
Right. But when you look at the climate, it's a system problem. It's not, yes, it's made up of millions of individual choices, right? But for most of us, you guys are doing your part. For most of us, the grind of life is such that the ability to change the system at an individual level is very, very fractional. When you step back and you go, okay, this is a systems problem, we need a whole systems approach. Agriculture becomes key. Now, even if you just look at it from the IPCC report, agriculture is somewhere between 26%, depending on how you crunch the math, to 40 something percent. Some people will say as much as 50% um, of,
Of GHGs. That's what
right,
you're saying. Right.
exactly. Yeah.
That's greenhouse gas emissions.
Yeah. So even if you just said, okay, we're just going to work on emissions reduction. We're not even going to deal with your crazy talk about sequestering carbon, pulling it out of the atmosphere. Whoa, that's too much. We're just going to talk about reduction, right? Even if we said, look, let's institute a global shift in agriculture such that net, when we produce food, we are producing zero net GHGs, right? Greenhouse gases. That would be a massive shift. And it's accomplishable within a very short period of time, 10, 15 years, max, with almost no major technological infrastructure changes. So we're not mining lithium, we're not mining uranium, we're not mining cobalt, we're not creating new vehicles to do this. This is with current practices, shifting practices, not shifting technological innovation across the supply chain.
Right. Right.
And so when you realize, oh my gosh, okay, why aren't we doing that? That's the low hanging fruit, right? We're going after these really expensive technological fixes for cities. And I'm not saying all of that shouldn't be done, right? But where we can win fast and win at scale is with the 9 billion acres of agriculture around the planet. Just in the US, we have almost a billion acres, right? 900 million acres. Why is that not the first focus? Because when we do that, we also produce higher nutritional content of food. We reduce pesticides, which we're all ingesting, and we radically change the nutritional balance of the nation that's doing it. So it's almost like, don't care about climate? That's okay. Do you care about food? Do you care about your health? Do you care about your kids? Let's do it for those reasons. And the climate is, for a certain section of the population, not the priority. And that's okay. It doesn't have to be to make these wins. So I think philosophically, we haven't thought about this as a solution set, just as another problem set. What needs to change is fairly elemental. The changes that we're talking about, at least in the United States, are a reintegration of crops and livestock. It's stopping tilling, which releases carbon and water into the atmosphere. It's using cover crops instead of fallowing fields. It's very simple changes that occur in as little as a year. We've seen farmers who adopt these changes reduce their pesticides by 50%, increase their profits by 50% in the first year. So it's not costing them money, right? That's, I wish it was something that was like, whoa, look, here's the genie. I just but it's so simple. And that's part of why I think it has been overlooked, is because we tend toward, as humans, we're tool makers. We want the big gadget, the big shiny thing that we can sell on Wall Street. And this is quite different than that.
Yeah, yeah. And I should point out to our members who aren't aware, this is at the core mission of this organization. Vice President Gore's very farm outside of Nashville, Caney Fork Farms, has become a kind of a laboratory for this very kind of science and incorporating, different crops and livestock and things and incorporating all of these regen agricultural practices. Um, and I I find myself always curious about how you would answer the skeptics who say, this organic, healthy farming, regen stuff, that sounds fine for the people who can go to Whole Foods and pay $100 a pound for their cauliflower. But what about for regular people? Are we going to price food out so people in less advantaged communities are actually going to be able to have food? Or is this just a rich white people in the suburbs approach to agriculture? And I know you have answers for this, but I'd like you to share them with the crowd about the scalability.
Yeah, I think there's two answers to that question. I don't think it's a one size fits all. Is 65% of the American diet is processed and hyper processed calories. So it's corn, soy, and wheat. Three crops that have been put in bags, boxes, cartons, and bottles and shoved into the center of the grocery store, right? And that's why our nation is fat, sick, and almost dead. There were no childhood diabetes cases per thousand. It was incalculably low in the 1950s. There was no such thing as prenatal diabetes. What is that? How did that happen, right? We're so conditioned in terms of our neurological responses. Our brains have actually been conditioned to taste things that are not food. So on one level, we're very much talking about a war, a food war, right? That has been waged against the American public in the interest of certain profiteering companies, against health, against well-being, and actually against thinking. This actually hurts the way we think. So we've got to look at that. You can't just say, look, let's just shift our food system without shifting what we're putting in our mouths. The second piece of it is where we're seeing uptick in regenerative farming is in food, a lot of food that you already eat that you don't even know that it's becoming regenerative. The early goal of the two films is to transition 100 million acres in the US to transitional regenerative, meaning it's in progress. Right now, today, the United States, we have about 50 million acres already. That's since 2020, since Kiss the Ground launched. 50 million acres in transition to regenerative agriculture. That's insane. Bear in mind, it took, what, 50 years to get 5 or 6 million acres into certified organic?
Right. So
In
in a few
five
years,
years.
we've gone from just a tiny bit to 50 million out of 900 million. So
Yeah.
that's a big
Yeah.
start.
Yeah. So I think we'll see the full goal reached, the 100 million acres, within 2 more years by 2027, at which point we'll be at 10% of US ag. When social scientists talk about a tipping point, they talk about 10%. That's when a system changes, right? So we're not talking about, hey, you have to go buy really expensive food at really fancy grocery stores. We're talking about consumers pushing back on commodity foods, just meat, soy, wheat, hay, corn, these things that the United States is really good at producing in bulk, and saying, we are going to change our dietary practices. While we do that, you're going to change the way you produce this stuff. And it's a 1-2 punch.
That's a good answer. And I am sure from the first film, you're addressing it in the second film as well. And that's just really a reason for all of you to tune in and watch the film. It's really well crafted, I'm quite sure. The I want to ask you a couple personal questions because we're short on time, and I want to kind of not avoid not I want to avail myself of the opportunity of you as a climate advocate, which is something that you share in common with the people in our membership. Can you talk a little bit about your journey to making these films, to getting interested in this subject, and perhaps something you learned in the process that was a key moment that said, "This is where I'm going to do this."
Yeah, I did not come to this from, a strictly wanting to make films background. My mother stuck a protest sign in my hand. I think I was, like I said, very young.
And what were you protesting?
I think my mother and I have an ongoing debate about this. I think it was an anti-nuclear protest. She remembers it as something else. But we moved to Louisiana when I was 9, and to an area called Cancer Alley. It's an area between Baton Rouge and Houston, has about 150 petrochemical facilities in a 100-mile stretch of I-10. It's the largest concentration of oil and gas facilities in North America, makes about 50% of the nation's fuel. The last major environmental review was in 1978. Cancer incidence in that area is 800 times the national average, according to the Times-Picayune, which is Louisiana's primary newspaper. And so I moved from a relatively clean environment to a shockingly toxic environment at a young age. And it got me interested in science. I did water quality projects. I was looking at, you know, what's in the water? Why are people sick? Why is this happening? Why does everybody get lymphoma, leukemia? The list just went on and on and on, right? And, did that through high school, went to the state science fair. And when I got to college, I got really interested in alternative energy, solar power, wind. I'm kind of old. So it was like the 90s, right? Solar wasn't like a thing yet. It wasn't, you couldn't just like call up Cal Edison and get your solar panels. That wasn't, it was like, what? What's a solar panel? Where does it come from? How does it work? So we were, looking at this as alternative energy. And inside of that, I was working on farms as a woofer. Once upon a
Don't tell
time,
them what a woofer is.
it was used to be willing workers of organic farms. There's a more politically correct rebranding that's occurred. But basically, you go volunteer on a farm somewhere. And so I volunteered and I worked on farms across Europe. And I found a farm in former East Germany where they were making biodiesel. And they were using less land to make the fuel for their tractor than their grandfather had used to make the hay for the horses, the draft horses, right? For them, it was a massive efficiency gain. And for me, it was like mind blowing. I came from an oil state where people were dying for oil. I was like, why don't we just grow our fuel? So I came back to the US, made something called the Veggie Van, drove around on used frying oil for 2 years, and got involved actually in working with farmers who wanted to continue to sort of augment their income from soybean oil and making biodiesel. Universally, those farms had one problem: the soil was going away. It didn't matter how much they grew or how much fertilizer they put on the land. The amount of money that they had to spend to keep the exact same production, or maybe a little bit more, was going up and up and up. They were losing their farms. And I was like, well, maybe it has something to do with your soil, right? And that's what led us eventually to Kiss the Ground after making 3 movies on oil. Once again, the sort of the soil advocates of our friends, Kiss the Ground, the organization headed by Rylan Engelhart and Finian Makepeace, they really wanted us to do a film on soil. I was like, it's kind of a downgrade. We start with oil, we're doing soil. It's going to be boring. But somehow, enough people got committed and the team behind it, yeah, made a
Well, you
pretty good
packed
film.
it with celebrities. You packed it with I can tell you from a film background myself, from seeing Kiss the Ground, it is one of the slickest, best implemented, clearest, easiest to understand, and approachable environmental films I've ever seen. And so you have exceptional skill as a filmmaker. And I'm not just saying that to praise you because you're here. I can tell you professionally, I would be very proud of those films. They're really really nice work. I've seen some of the earlier films as well, and I'm going to now open it up to questions from our group. But I have one more thing I want to do, which is something I end all my interviews, my portion with. What I ask you there inevitably in the work of environmental advocacy, there are days, months, times when you have been working to reach your goal and you just keep getting a no. You get told no, no, no over and over and over, and you just want to give up.
Mm.
And one of the things we ask our environmental climbers, movers, and shakers interview series interviewees is, what is it that you personally do when you've reached one of those roadblocks and you know that you gotta somehow fortify yourself to get up another day and keep fighting what seems like a tremendously difficult hurdle that you have to get over?
I wish I had the perfect answer.
There's no
Having,
perfect answer.
having done this for 4 decades plus, environmental burnout is a real thing. Taking care of your mental health is a real thing. And people who are tangential to the movement or don't know the level of commitment to those inside the movement, especially deep green advocates, tend to not understand the level of mental burden and stress. Some of the most mentally, delicate people that I've gotten to know are people who are deep in the climate movement. They understand the facts and the numbers and they crunch it, and they're on ice shelves and they're drilling ice cores, and you really see the stress of understanding where we're going with our ecosystem challenges. So I think we underestimate the need to take care of ourselves. Me, I go for a walk, I go for a swim, a hike, bike ride, get outside, get far away from the computer screen, far away from the news of the day, and just kind of be in nature. And the more I can do that, and the more my nervous system can reset, uh, sometimes it takes 2 or 3 days. It's taken longer when I've really hit the wall and I'm like, we are failing miserably. And sometimes you need to take a week and just go camp on the beach and just be like, all right, just gonna
Well,
throw the
glad you're
frisbee
doing
and
what
look
you're
at
doing.
waves.
Yeah. All right, Michael, could you take us out of Spotlight, and I will open it up to raising a virtual hand so we can do some questions here. And while we're being taken out of Spotlight, go ahead with Andy. Why don't you give us the first question?
Right. Thank you, Josh, for joining us, and thank you for your work. I want to acknowledge that you were one of the first people to focus on water, and I kind of wanted to get your feel for why haven't people been focused on water and really addressing that, since water is life, and that's been the principal issue, that we need water not only to drink and survive, but we need water for the crops. And if we actually had more water available, then we wouldn't be scrambling for survival, for food production, and just to maintain our communities and make them more sustainable.
Yeah.
I know it's a loaded question.
It's a great question though. I think the simplest answers are the hardest ones to get to, you know? I really do. When I first learned about permaculture in the 90s, and it was Bill Mollison, and people were talking about water, and they're like, slow it, spread it, sink it. I was like, so easy. Like anyone can get that. Like whatever. Um, and I think when you don't understand that when you do that across a landscape, you change the climate, not of, a backyard. You change the climate. Australia is a great example. We just filmed in Australia. Australia, which is, for those of you who know it, it's as big as the continental United States. It's largely a desert. In 1788, when the first European settlers arrived, it was an interconnected network of wetlands. It was a wetland. They drained and dehydrated an entire continent in, roughly 200 years. That's amazing. And so it's hot in Australia now, right? There's fires, there's drought, there's, mouse plagues. Why? Because the water's gone, right? And I think what maybe a little bit of a hint to your answer is we have a very short ecological memory. We don't teach exactly how that field used to look 10 years ago, 25 years ago, 50 years ago, 100 years ago, 200 years ago. We've moved so quickly into this industrial timeline that the linkages that keep humans and land tied have been severed in most places. And so it's easy to forget about water because carbon dioxide is ultimately a technological problem, and we want to fix it with technology. And the irony of that is almost 100% of the technology that we want to fix carbon dioxide with makes more carbon dioxide. It's like, whereas water, slow it, spread it, sink it, and you fix the climate.
Peter.
Thank you.
Hi, thank you. Pete Suchman from Long Island chapter in New York of Climate Reality. I'm working with the Education Committee to develop a high school teacher's toolkit to teach climate science on a level that is appropriate to high school students. And I'm wondering, can you help us with any of the A-list actors to become influencers and present climate lessons? It would be so well accepted by the kids.
You know what? That is a brilliant idea. I love that idea. Leave that with me.
Okay.
Right now, I'm trying to grab, 5 or 10 minutes of their time for a couple of shout outs on social media for the film. But, on the back end of Kiss the Ground and Common Ground, there is a free educational version available on the website, commongroundfilm.org.
Yes.
And we're right in the final moments of just about to upload the curriculum that goes with Common Ground.
Good.
But I love your idea. Love your idea of going to them with the next set of asks once the films are out and saying, listen,
All right.
this
Great.
is
My email is in the chat.
okay. Thank you, Peter. Appreciate
Thank you.
That's great.
Our Los Angeles food co-chair captain or co-chair committee co-chair, Cindy Cotter, you're up next.
Hi, I love both films. And I trained with Kiss the Ground, but one of the things that we were taught when I trained with Kiss the Ground is animal integration is part of the definition of regenerative agriculture. And I know Gabe Brown uses that in his definition. And you mentioned it when you were talking about it.
Mhm.
And yet, vegetarianism and veganism and eating less meat is very popular in climate circles. What do you say to people who disagree with you on that subject? How do you deal with that?
That's a great question, Cindy. Thank you. First of all, I think everybody's eating choices. That's a very personal choice. I never, ever, ever tell anybody what to eat or not eat. I do point out what we eat as a country, and how it's connected to our health. But the thing that everybody has to get related to, that very, very few of us who live in cities are related to, is what is the condition of land? Most people who would drive from Los Angeles to San Francisco or vice versa have driven along the I-5. Probably less than 5% of those people have ever ventured further than a gas station. But as I said, the Central Valley is the largest producer of pulses in the United States. If you take a 15-minute drive off of I-5, go into the middle of the Central Valley, park your car, walk out in a field, because when you're looking at crops, you look from the side like this as you're going by in your car, and they look like this. You're like, oh, it's green, it's lovely. Walk out in a field, look down, put your hand down, and pull up. What you're going to pull up is sand. You're not going to pull up dirt. You're going to pull up sand, silica. The carbon's gone. The water's gone. It's being pumped in from a life support system, the aqueduct system, the largest in the world next to a small island. And it's time shifted so that it rains in Oregon and Washington. We bank that water and then we use it. It's a brilliant system, but it's life support. We're farming on the moon. Instead of being the largest carbon sink and a water battery that can mitigate climate change, we've created a moonscape. And we spray it with chemicals, and we pay people who we don't even count in our agricultural census to work that land. Field workers don't count in the USDA census of 2 million farmers. the 3 to 6 million people who actually grow our food, right? You will not see animals unless they're in a pen, a California dairy or a feedlot, right? And you go, this system is insane. Insane. If you want to produce tofu, you have to time shift water, spray pesticides, pay field workers, spray them with pesticides so they can go home and get sick and die. And meanwhile, you've lost all the carbon and all the water from the ecosystem. Versus taking that same livestock, running across the land, building soil fertility, building up crops, building up biodiversity, and then you've still got livestock. In fact, in order to heal the land, the United States, we need denser packs and we need them to move faster and not come back for 6 months to a year. You would actually have to produce more animals. And so there is a misunderstanding, a broken ecological context, and a fundamental lack of 6th grade biology in this country. And because we have that, we have the fantasy that ecology works without animals. And I can take anyone, any human being on earth on a tour of all 50 states, every major agricultural region in this country, and I can show them desertification because of the mismanagement or complete lack of animals.
And to that point, Josh, I think it's important we point out that that's not compatible with a vision that is not promoting eating more meat. You can have the animals without necessarily harvesting them as food sources.
You don't have to eat them.
Right,
That's,
right.
We didn't eat all the bison that roamed the country. You didn't eat all
Right.
the woolly mammoths. People didn't eat all of the horses. These creatures, the herbivores and ungulates of the planet, they didn't all get eaten.
I have a question that's one of my own that I wanted to answer if I ask you if I had time, and since we don't have a hand, I'm going to throw it in. Um, I have done a good reading and a good amount of reading on, and also spoken to several people who've studied how to best develop stronger mycorrhizal networks within the crops that we support. And there is an argument that one of the things that we can do to really help that, in addition to the regen agriculture practices, is to try to switch to commodity crops that are native to the regions where they're being grown. And so I look at stuff like we have crops we have commodity crops that are no longer used, ancient grains like pit seed foot and swampweed I think there's one called knotweed that I'm not that familiar with, that are within regions of the United States where we now grow far flung crops from far away.
Mm-hmm.
Do you have any thoughts on integrating those ancient grains and things back into what we're doing as part of this larger effort?
I do. I mean, in a perfect world, we would do that, and the kernza and all of these grains that we're seeing pop up in, again, sort of high-priced health food stores.
Sure.
Um, that would become part and parcel of how we're producing. I think there's a pathway to getting there, and we have to be realistic about this stuff. What I love seeing is very traditional grain farmers in the Midwest who are, trained in the commodity crop, industrial, monocrop agricultural system from, a farm trade institution or land grant university. And they've been trained on the Monsanto model. And they go, I just integrated one group of animals sort of around the side. And I just started planting some hedgerows. And, I was able to cut my Roundup use by 50% in the first year. And the next year they come and they go, I was thinking, I don't know if I want to plant Terminator corn this year. I want to do a fifth of my fields with seeded corn that ironically, the USDA keeps all of these genetic varieties and you can order your own, right? So what I've seen farmers start on that trajectory, and 5 years later, they have seeded their own crop. They started it in little window planters, and then they move it into a quarter of an acre, and then it's an acre, and then it's 5 acres, and then it's 20, and then it's 100. And all of a sudden, they have enough seed for their entire farm. And that epigenetic trait of that corn that they got from the USDA that they're able to reseed, because it's not a terminator seed, it's not genetically modified. The epigenetics of that seed are adapting to that environment. Fast forward 5 years, that farmer has their own genetic traits that are working on that farm. And if they're used to that, they're going to be able to plant triticale, rye, they're going to be able to plant wheat, corn, sorghum, sunflowers, soybeans. That mixture, even though they're traditional crops, is going to fix nitrogen, it's going to stabilize carbon, and it's going to build a biodiversity above ground of all sorts of small species that we rely on for life. And so I think, yes, eventually going back to sort of a native prairie grassland system, kind of like the Land Institute and Salina, Kansas promotes. But meanwhile, just working with the basic tools, even though they may be a little rough, the simple commodity crops of, sunflowers, soy, corn, wheat, hay, but using the knowledge of regeneration, the difference is night and day,
Yeah.
night and day
Yeah.
for those farms, night and
Yeah.
day.
Don't make the enemy the perfect, or the perfect the enemy of the good, kind of a thing in the process. Yeah. That makes perfect sense. Andy, I'm going to let you have the last question, and then we're going to wrap it up here with Josh. Go ahead.
Thank you. Josh, again, thanks to your work, based on your experience, I know you did the documentary and you had a lot of celebrities. What messenger do you think speaks most or resonates most with the farmers who actually have to make these changes? Because I know in a lot of these areas, we may not be the ideal messenger because we're environmentalists. And I would rather see the change be made rather than it necessarily come from us. So I want to end with that. How do we make that change even if it doesn't come from us?
Yeah, that's such a great and thoughtful and sort of humbling question. I think the best person to advocate within farm communities are farmers. And that's, the stakes are pretty high, guys. Like the clock's ticking, right? And, we're at COP30 this year in Belém, Brazil. And if you count back 30 years ago and you look at where the conversation was with carbon and James Hansen giving his testimony, even in 1988 to Congress and saying, look, this is happening. We have consistently failed to galvanize a broad-based movement. And it's hard to hear those words because I grew up in this movement. This has been my life, right? But if you look out across America and you go, God, who are we missing? We're extremely coastal. We're still extremely, of one sort of race and class and group of people. And when we think about farmers, I mean, they physically interact with more land than anybody else, right? And if that land is the key to stabilizing climate, man, I think we've got to do everything we can to build the bridges now because we've tried everything else. We've got to create a movement that is broad-based and is based in flyover states and may not be called a climate movement. We may be doing it for certain reasons that others will not do it for. But trust me, those communities are suffering from skyrocketing cancer, skyrocketing health problems, and it's in the children. It's not in the adults now. So they get it. And it's up to us to build those bridges and break down the barriers, get rid of the political rhetoric and just say, look, where can we agree that we need to use land as a way to heal not just our country, but our bodies. And yeah, the weather. Sometimes you have to use that word instead. That's okay. We're talking about the same thing. We're using different terms, right? So it's, we really have to think outside the box now because we don't have the luxury of We no longer have the luxury of having an elitist movement where we talk in echo chambers. The stakes are too high and the time is too short.
Josh, thank you so much for that wonderful answer and for being here tonight. I can tell you, as somebody who was raised in a farming community in Kansas myself, that 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 kind of your kind of messaging appeals to me so much, because I can have that conversation with my family in rural Kansas, and I can have that conversation with people out here. And the very name of the film Common Ground shows that you're thinking on multiple levels there with what you're talking about. And just really, really appreciate you being here. I want to thank Amy Prenner, who also helped put this together through months of us organizing and helped make this happen. Thank you, Amy. Also, of course, your filmmaker partner and partner in life, Rebecca Tickell, who is unable to be with us here this evening, but a very important part of this entire process as well. And I just want to say we really appreciate you. Keep up the work. Everybody, Common Ground and Kiss the Ground will be available on Amazon Prime on Earth Day, April 22nd. And also, as mentioned in the chat by Don from our Chicago chapter, that we have access to the educational version of the film as well. And we might talk about doing something with that. It's a shorter version, right, of the film. So there's something else that might be discussed going forward in our chapter. But again, thank you so much, and we greatly appreciate you. Keep up the good work, buddy.
Appreciate all of you. Thank you. Have a great night, everybody.